Welcome to Recurring Insight. It's the beginning of your upkeep, so it's time for another episode. I'm your host, Michael, and let's dive in. This time, we're taking a look at the new cards from Modern Horizons 2. Specifically, we're looking at the cards most likely to see play in cEDH, and comparing them to existing cards to see how they stack up. Anyways, let's look at the non-creature spells first. I went back and forth a couple times about Dress Down, which wasn't helped by its closest comparable card not seeing play in cEDH. You can't really use it to deal with stacks pieces preventing you from comboing off, as even if a combo doesn't directly use creatures, like Dramatic Scepter, you still need some type of outlet, like Urza. However, you can use it to blank someone else's win attempt for a turn. Unlike the previous situation though, where you're trying to deal with the stacks piece, they might be able to just combo off the next turn unless they're using something like Thoracle. In either case, I'd almost always rather have a counterspell, so I'm skeptical about it seeing play. Maybe it'll be run in Jessica decks or other decks that don't need a creature to win, but I don't think it'll be worth it outside of that. Gaia's Will, despite being cheaper than Yawgmoth's Will, is just too slow. Maybe if you play a turn 1 or 2 it'll be worth it, but a lot of the decks that run Yawgmoth's Will run it to help close out the game, like Adnaw's decks that plan to reuse rituals with it. Since Gaia's Will triggers on your upkeep, you can't cast a bunch of rituals and then reuse them unless you plan to use the mana at instant speed. No matter how powerful of an effect it is, it's just too slow. I'm not sure if Dam will see play. It's cheaper than Rift, but it's symmetrical and, more importantly, it's at sorcery speed. This really affects how effective the non-overloaded version of the spell is. However, since it is versatile, I remain cautiously optimistic about it. It may still see play in controlling decks that rely very little on creatures. Endurance has one large downside, one neutral difference, and one upside compared to Tormod's Crypt. First of all, it's more expensive. You either pay an additional 3 mana or an additional card. Second of all, it puts the cards into the library rather than in exile. This can be good or bad. It doesn't remove the cards from the graveyard permanently, but it also stops Thoracle, which will be a huge draw. Finally, it's instant speed. In total, I think the card is a lot better than Tormod's Crypt, which really only sees play in decks that care about artifacts, like Urza. It'll likely see play in mid-range and controlling decks, especially the ones that win with Twister Loops. I'm torn on Out of Time. On one hand, you'll more than likely hit enough creatures that'll keep them out of commission for a while. On the other hand, Toxic Deluge sees play mostly in controlling decks, so the decks likely to play Out of Time are also the ones that will likely draw the game out. On the other hand, you don't have to pay life, and the creatures can't be recurred without removing the enchantment. It will likely see play in non-green, low-color, controlling decks. Mind Collapse is sort of what I expected Fury to be, but I still don't think it'll see much play. It'll likely be run in the same decks that run Lightning Bolt, like Godo, Grenzo, and I think some Roger Silas lists are on Bolt too. Even though you'll rarely cast it when it's not your turn, it's also removal that doesn't impact the amount of mana you have until the turn after you use it, so you can hit a stacks piece before comboing off without wasting any mana. Profane Tutor doesn't even compare to Demonic Tutor. You have to wait 2 turns after suspending it, so it's slow and clearly telegraphed. The only deck I can see playing it is Cody, but honestly, it's good enough there that it still deserves a place here. You can activate Cody, cast a 1-mana spell, then cast Profane Tutor off of Cody's ability to find Ad Nauseam. This deck is incredibly consistent in going for a turn 2 or 3 win. I think Solitude is going to be very limited. White tends to be a support color, which means that besides 1 and 2 color decks, not many will be able to pay the evoke cost consistently. It also 2-for-1s you for an effect that was printed at 1 mana, so I'm really not sure it'll be worth it. Even in lower color decks, I don't think it'll see much, if any, play. Strike It Rich seems like a weaker Lotus Petal. It costs 1 more upfront, which means it isn't mana positive. However, you can flash it back, so it's got a higher ceiling. Nonetheless, it won't see play in decks that don't play Lotus Petal, which means it'll be limited to extremely proactive decks or decks running Breach. Step Through will be a very niche card. It's certainly not worth it to hardcast, but there are more Spellseeker lines popping up, so it could see play in those decks. There's an Inala line, an Arami line, as well as one in Jeskai that sets you up for the Breach combo. It can find Thoracle, but if you're running Thoracle, you're running black, which means you have more than enough other tutors that you don't need to rely on a card that will hit hard when you reveal it off of Adnaz. I really wish hardcasting it provided a more powerful effect, but as it is, it's going to be limited to low color decks with Spellseeker lines or lines off of another wizard. Suspend seems like it's just a tad behind Pongify and Rapid Hybridization. It does come with a pretty short time limit, but a lot of times that's all you need to get rid of a stacks piece. It seems like it would work best in proactive decks, but since proactive decks tend to run less removal, it'll likely be sidelined unless the deck doesn't have access to some of the better options. Urza's Saga is closest to Inventor's Fair, but there are some glaring differences. You don't have to pay to activate it, nor do you need Metalcraft, but you are on a stricter timeline and have a more limited selection of targets. That's not to mention that on the second lore counter, it's more or less useless. In total, I don't think it's worth it to just grab a Mana Crypt. It'll most likely only see play in decks that can use it to find a combo piece, like Sensei's Divining Top. I'm not sure how I feel about Void Mirror. When I first saw it, I got really hyped, but now I just think it's overrated. It hits free spells and colorless spells, assuming they're paid for with colorless mana. There are a decent amount of free spells in the format, but as you can just pay colored mana for the colorless spell, it's more of a minor inconvenience unless you happen to be short on colored mana. In total, I don't think being able to stop only free spells will be worth it unless you pair it with Knowledge Pool or Omen Machine like Lavinia does. Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth won't have a large impact on the format, but it will likely see play in lower color decks or decks running Hermit Druid or Tainted Pact. Awesome, onto the creatures. There are some real doozies here, especially the first one. Unlike Rest in Peace, it's not symmetrical, but it doesn't deal with cards already in the yard, and it has more stringent color requirements. However, it also lets you crack it to cast an exiled card without paying the mana cost. This is huge, and it's certainly going to be a staple. Diamond Lion, on the other hand, I'm much more skeptical of. LED really only sees play for its combo potential, and Diamond Lion requires a haste enabler to be used for combos. Even then, you only net 1 mana compared to LED's 3, so the payoff is drastically less. I only included it because it seemed like there was a decent amount of hype around it, so I figured I should address it rather than wait for someone to comment about it. Esper Sentinel is awesome. It's much more limited than Mystic Remora, despite being the same cost, and is also easier to pay for. However, Fish is busted, so it being worse than Fish still leaves a lot of room for playability. Since Sentinel doesn't have cumulative upkeep, you'll be able to advance your own game plan without paying to keep it alive. This will likely see play in controlling decks that aren't stacks oriented. If there's a stacks deck playing white, they're probably on Rule of Law to deal with Naws. It being a creature also opens up some cool synergies, like Heliod being able to buff it to increase the amount that has to be paid. Goblin Anarchomancer is a huge upgrade to the medallions. However, the medallions rarely see play outside of monocolored decks, and I really think this is going to be very limited if it sees play at all. It seems a little too slow to really be mainstream. Ignoble Hierarch is like Noble Hierarch, but Jund. It's really good. I think it'll make it into any deck that can run it, even Turbo Naws or controlling decks, which respectively tend to rely on artifacts for their explosive potential or to accommodate running board wipes. Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer, doesn't have a good counterpart, but it is extremely good, and I'm pretty sure it'll reach stable status. Ragavan provides ramp and card advantage, both of which are huge in the early game. It will get worse the longer the game goes on, but you only need to connect once to get your investment back, so although it'll be best in faster decks, it'll still see play in mid-range and disruptive decks. Sanctifier and Vex seems like it'll be too narrow. Unlike Rip, it's got protection from black and red, which could be a huge boon, as it not only dodges the more narrow removal in black and red, but also Assassin's Trophy and Abrupt Decay. Exiling red cards from the graveyard will have very little impact, but it can hose Razaketh decks or other decks that play with the graveyard. However, that doesn't seem like it'll be enough reason for it to see play, as there are plenty of other yard strats that get around this, like Breach. Sanctum Weaver requires more build around than Bloom Tender, as you need enchantments rather than just a permanent of another color to start abusing it. However, in heavy stacks decks, this can do a lot of work. Additionally, it creates infinite mana of any color with Freed from the Real or Pemenzora without any other cards on the field. Although it's not a popular combo, the density of cards that combo with it are rising, so I think the combo as a whole will see a slight rise in play in stacks decks with an infinite mana outlet in the command zone, and this card will see play with it. And that's about it. In total, I think that this set will for sure have an impact on the format, not necessarily in a good way. There's a lot of support in here for Ad Naus decks, which are already drawing a lot of concern. Cody especially gets a lot from this set, enough that some people consider it the best in the format, and it's hard to disagree with them. Dauthi Voidwalker is also going to make some waves, as it's more or less an auto-include in any deck running black. Unfortunately, I think Voidwalker and the Ad Naus support are going to drastically overshadow the other cool cards in this set. Thank you guys so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. I'm your host Michael, and I'll see you at the beginning of your next upkeep for another episode of Recurring Insight.